In the summer of 1943, a young American pilot named Robert Johnson found himself in a nightmare at 20,000 feet over France. 16 German Focke-Wulf 190s had bounced his formation, and his P-47 Thunderbolt had been hit by 21 cannon shells and more than 200 machine gun rounds. The hydraulic system had ruptured. The canopy had shattered, shrapnel was lodged in his leg, and a bullet had grazed the tip of his nose. The cockpit was on fire, and the aircraft was spiraling toward the earth. Johnson somehow regained control, but he could not bail out because the damaged canopy was jammed shut. Then a German pilot pulled alongside, examined the shattered American fighter in apparent disbelief, rocked his wings in what appeared to be a salute, and turned back toward France. Johnson nursed his crippled aircraft across the English Channel and landed at Royal Air Force Manston with over 200 holes in his fuselage. The aircraft was immediately scrapped. Johnson went on to become one of the greatest aces in American history. Meanwhile, on the ground in Normandy, German soldiers learned to fear a different side of the same aircraft. Major Helmut Rittgen of the Panzer Lehr Division later wrote that every road to his panzers was monitored by murderous circling thunderbolts. The operations diary of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division recorded wild confusion in all units and heavy losses caused by Jabo attacks. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, and entire columns refused to move until darkness fell. These contrasting perspectives capture everything the P-47 Thunderbolt was, and everything it became. An aircraft so massive that pilots initially mocked it as a 7-ton flying bathtub, so rugged that it could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter, and so devastating in combat that it would ultimately claim more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter, while simultaneously becoming the most feared ground attack weapon in the Allied arsenal. This is the true story of how a Georgian immigrant designed an aircraft that helped win the Second World War. The man who created the Thunderbolt was born Alexander Kartveli on September 9, 1896, in Tbilisi, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. The name Kartveli derives from the Georgian word for Georgian, as Georgians call themselves Kartvelebi. He came from a noble Georgian family and received an education befitting his status. He trained as an artillery officer and served in the First World War in the Russian army, experiencing firsthand the devastation that modern weapons could inflict. When the Russian Revolution swept away the old order, the brief, independent Georgian Republic sent Kartveli to Paris in 1919 to study aeronautics. It was a fateful decision. Georgia would soon be absorbed into the Soviet Union, and Kartveli would never return to his homeland. He graduated in 1922 from France's most prestigious aviation school, the institution now known as I.S.A.E. Superiore. His brilliance was evident from the start, but so was his precarious situation as a penniless émigré cut off from family resources. His early years in Paris were marked by both brilliance and desperation. He briefly worked as a test pilot, but was seriously injured in a crash, ending his flying career permanently. The injury could have ended his aviation ambitions entirely. Instead, it redirected them. Unable to fly aircraft, he would design them instead. To support himself financially while studying, he reportedly performed as a trapeze artist in a Paris circus. The image seems incongruous, a future aviation genius swinging through the air on a rope to earn bread money, but it speaks to his determination to survive and pursue his calling. He found work at the Louis Blériot Company and contributed to aircraft designs for Société Industrielle, one of which set a world speed record in 1924. His aviation success brought him to the attention of American entrepreneur Charles Levine, famous as the first transatlantic airplane passenger. Levine invited him to New York in 1927, and Kartveli arrived in America essentially penniless, but carrying something more valuable than money. He carried a vision of what aircraft could become. He joined Levine's Atlantic Aircraft Corporation as head of engineering in 1928, but when that company failed, Kartveli found himself adrift again. Then fate intervened in the form of another Georgian émigré named Alexander de Seversky. De Seversky had been a Russian naval aviator who lost his leg in combat during the First World War, yet continued flying with a prosthetic. The two men shared Georgian heritage, a passion for high-performance aircraft, and the drive of immigrants determined to prove themselves in their adopted country. Kartveli joined Seversky's company in 1931 and became chief engineer almost immediately. He designed the aircraft that became the P-35, the United States Army's first modern all-metal, retractable gear, enclosed cockpit, single-seat fighter. It was a watershed moment in American aviation. When Seversky was forced out by his board of directors in 1939, the company was renamed Republic Aviation Corporation, and Kartveli continued as chief designer and vice president. The design progression that led to the Thunderbolt followed a deliberate path through increasingly powerful designs. P-35 gave way to P-41, then P-43 Lancer, then P-44 rocket. Each iteration was bigger, faster, and more powerful, as Kartveli pursued his vision of the ultimate high-altitude fighter. When the Army Air Corps cancelled the P-44 contract and demanded a fighter that could match the latest European combat aircraft, Kartveli sketched an entirely new design during his train ride back to New York. His approach was unorthodox and ingenious. He designed the turbo-supercharger ducting system first, then built the fuselage around it. Other designers started with the airframe and tried to fit the engine and equipment inside. Kartveli started with the heart of the aircraft, the system that would give it its high-altitude performance, and let everything else follow. When engineers told him the aircraft would be enormous, Kartveli reportedly replied that it would be a dinosaur, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. When American pilots first saw the P-47 in late 1942 and early 1943, the reaction was shock, disdain, and dark humor. The aircraft was staggeringly large for a single-seat fighter. The wingspan measured 40 feet 9 inches, the length was 36 feet 1 inch, and the height exceeded 14 feet. Empty, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. At maximum takeoff weight, it could reach over 17,000 pounds, roughly 3 times the weight of a Spitfire. British pilots who inspected the aircraft shuddered and politely informed their American comrades that they were about to die. One British joke held that a Thunderbolt pilot could defend himself from a Luftwaffe fighter by running around and hiding in the fuselage. Another suggested that if a Thunderbolt pilot found himself in a turning fight, he should simply unbuckle his harness and run to the other side of the cockpit, since there was room enough for a foot race. No one was unhappier than the 4th Fighter Group, the former Eagle Squadron pilots who had flown elegant Spitfires with the Royal Air Force. These Americans had crossed the Atlantic to fight before their own country entered the war, had served with distinction under British command, and had developed an almost physical bond with the Spitfire. The aircraft was an extension of their bodies, responsive to the lightest touch, capable of the most delicate maneuvers. Now they were being asked to give up their beloved Spitfires for these bloated American monsters. Colonel Don Blakesley, the group's aggressive commander, griped that the bulky, low-slung P-47 seemed reluctant to leave the ground and anxious to get back on it. The specific complaints were legitimate. The climb rate was poor at low and medium altitudes. Acceleration was sluggish. And the aircraft could not turn with a Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 at low altitude. It felt like a truck compared to the Spitfire's fingertip responsiveness. The first operational missions did nothing to improve morale. On March 10, 1943, P-47s from the 4th Fighter Group flew their first sortie over enemy territory, a fighter sweep over France. The mission failed due to severe radio interference caused by static from corroded magneto-ignition seals in the P-47's own engine, rendering the American radios unusable. It was an inauspicious beginning. The radios were replaced with British equipment, and missions resumed in April. On April 15, 1943, Colonel Don Blakesley finally scored the P-47's first aerial victory, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 near Ostend, Belgium. It was the first of thousands. After the mission, another pilot told Blakesley that the Jug could outdive them. Blakesley's reply became one of the war's most quoted lines. Well, it damn well ought to be able to dive, because it sure as hell cannot climb. The origin of the Jug nickname remains genuinely debated among historians. The strongest wartime evidence points to the aircraft's shape resembling a common glass milk jug of the era. The barrel fuselage and relatively small nose created a silhouette that pilots thought looked like the milk containers in their mess halls. Some historians argue it was short for Juggernaut, referencing the P-47's unstoppable force in a dive, though detailed analysis suggests this explanation originated from British aviation publications in the 1960s, rather than from wartime pilots. Other nicknames included T-Bolt, Big Ugly, bucket of bolts, and cast iron beast. Opinions changed dramatically as pilots discovered the aircraft's true strengths, but this transformation did not happen automatically. It required leadership, tactical innovation, and the courage to trust an aircraft that looked all wrong but flew just right. Colonel Hubert Zemke was critical to this transformation. Rather than encouraging discontent, he developed tactics that exploited the Thunderbolt's strengths while avoiding situations where it was weakest. His basic doctrine was simple: dive, fire, and recover. Use the P-47's devastating high-altitude performance and uncatchable dive speed. Attack from above, pour fire into the enemy, and pull up and away before they can respond. Never get into a low-altitude turning fight. Never try to outclimb a 109. Play to your strengths and make the enemy play your game. Captain Marvin Bledsoe of the 350th Fighter Squadron captured the evolving sentiment perfectly. How I loved to fly that airplane. I felt a surge of pride that I was a member of a combat fighter squadron and was flying the most powerful fighter ship in the world. Another pilot wrote in his diary that they never realized they loved the old barrel and her 8 guns so much. One P-47 pilot offered perhaps the most intimate tribute. When flying the Jug, I always felt as if I was in my mother's arms. The P-47's technical specifications explain both why it was so large and why it was so effective. Every dimension was dictated by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine and the General Electric turbo supercharger system that fed it. The R2800 was a masterpiece of American engineering, an air-cooled 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine displacing 2,804 cubic inches. It was one of the most powerful aircraft engines of its era, and it would prove to be one of the most reliable. In the definitive P-47D model, it produced 2,000 horsepower at normal power and 2,300 horsepower at war emergency power using water methanol injection. Later variants pushed output to 2,800 horsepower. The engine drove a massive Curtiss Electric 4-blade propeller, measuring 12 feet 2 inches in diameter, on early models. Later replaced by a 13-foot Curtiss Electric paddle blade propeller that dramatically improved climb and turning performance. What made the P-47 so physically large was not the engine alone but the turbo supercharger system. At high altitudes, the thin air provided insufficient oxygen for combustion. The turbo supercharger solved this problem by using exhaust gases to drive a turbine that compressed intake air before it reached the carburetor. This allowed the engine to maintain full power at altitudes where normally aspirated engines would have been gasping for air. The General Electric turbine sat deep in the rear fuselage, approximately 22 feet behind the propeller. Exhaust gases were routed from the engine through shrouded piping along both sides of the cockpit to drive the turbine at up to 21,300 revolutions per minute. The forward ends of the exhaust pipes glowed red at full power, a sight that startled new pilots until they realized it was normal. Compressed intake air then passed through an intercooler before being delivered forward to the carburetor. This elaborate ducting filled nearly the entire belly of the fuselage and gave the P-47 its distinctive barrel shape. The armament was devastating. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, with up to 425 rounds per gun for a total of 3,400 rounds on late production aircraft. The combined rate of fire reached approximately 100 rounds per second, sending a storm of lead into any target. For ground attack, the P-47 could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, roughly half the payload of a B-17 Flying Fortress, plus 10 5-inch rockets that could penetrate tank armor. Performance figures for the P-47D bubble top included a maximum speed of 426 to 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, a service ceiling exceeding 40,000 feet, and a range of 800 miles on internal fuel, extendable to over 1,000 miles with drop tanks. The long-range P-47 Newton variant, designed for the Pacific Theater, could reach approximately 2,000 miles with its redesigned wings containing integral fuel tanks. But the P-47's signature capability was its dive speed. It could routinely exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any Luftwaffe fighter, and later models incorporated compressibility recovery flaps to aid pullouts from high-speed dives. The experimental XP-47J reached 504 miles per hour in level flight on August 4, 1944, becoming the first piston-engine fighter to break the 500-mile-per-hour barrier. Luftwaffe pilots learned quickly that diving away from an attacking Thunderbolt was suicide. Protection was extensive. Hardened armor plate was installed fore and aft of the cockpit, with bullet-resistant glass shielding the windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks, lined with layers of rubber that swelled upon contact with fuel to plug bullet holes, held 305 gallons internally. The air-cooled radial engine itself served as a 2,400-pound steel and aluminum shield against frontal fire. Republic Aviation built the P-47 at two facilities. The primary plant at Farmingdale, Long Island, quadrupled its factory floor space during the war, expanding from a modest operation into an industrial giant. The 10,000th Thunderbolt rolled off this line on September 20, 1944, and was christened 10 Grand by the famous aviatrix Jacqueline Cochran. A second plant at Evansville, Indiana, produced P-47D models beginning in 1942. Additionally, Curtiss-Wright Corporation in Buffalo, New York, built 354 P-47G models under license. Total production reached approximately 15,683 aircraft, making the P-47 the most produced American fighter of the Second World War, narrowly surpassing the P-51 Mustang. The P-47D alone accounted for over 12,000 units. At war's end, nearly 6,000 additional P-47s on order were cancelled. The average cost was $83,000, roughly $1.4 million in today's currency, compared to approximately $51,000 for a P-51 Mustang. The higher cost reflected the P-47's complexity, size, and the sophisticated turbo supercharger system that no other American fighter used in the same way. The rivalry between the P-47 and P-51 Mustang was not just barroom talk among pilots. It was a genuine strategic argument that influenced the course of the air war. Each aircraft had decisive advantages the other lacked, and understanding both sides matters for comprehending how the air campaign over Europe was fought and won. The P-47's advocates pointed to its vastly superior survivability. A post-war study found the P-51 had a sortie loss rate of 1.2%, almost twice the P-47's 0.7%. P-51s were lost to ground fire at 3 times the rate of P-47s. The explanation was mechanical, fundamental to the basic design of each aircraft. The P-51's Rolls-Royce Merlin was a liquid-cooled engine with a vulnerable radiator and coolant system located in a scoop beneath the fuselage. A single bullet through a coolant line meant the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. Pilots had no options. They either bailed out or crashed. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800, by contrast, was an air-cooled radial that could absorb multiple hits and keep running even with cylinders shot away. There was no coolant to leak, no radiator to puncture. The engine might lose power, might run rough, might trail smoke, but it would keep turning long enough to get its pilot home. The P-47 also carried more firepower, 850 caliber machine guns with up to 3,400 rounds of ammunition, versus the P-51's 6 guns with 1,880 rounds. And it could haul 2,500 pounds of bombs versus 1,000 for the Mustang. But the P-51's decisive advantage was range. With drop tanks, the Mustang had a combat radius exceeding 850 miles, enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The P-47's radius, even with drop tanks, topped out around 475 miles with the D model. When General Jimmy Doolittle needed fighters to go deep into Germany and destroy the Luftwaffe, only the P-51 could do it. The Mustang was also lighter, climbed better at most altitudes, turned tighter at low altitude, was faster in level flight, and cost roughly half as much. Hub Zemke himself, the man who built the P-47's reputation more than anyone else, acknowledged in his book that the P-51B had the best performance of any United States fighter, and that he would have chosen the Mustang if given a free choice. The resolution of the debate was pragmatic rather than absolute. The P-51 became the primary escort fighter for deep penetration missions, while the P-47 became the supreme ground attack platform and shorter-range escort. As one historian put it, the P-51 got the glory, but the P-47 did the grunt work. Francis Stanley Gabreski, born Franciszek Stanisław Gabryszewski, arrived in the world on January 28, 1919, in Oil City, Pennsylvania, the son of Polish immigrants. His parents spoke Polish at home, and young Francis learned English in the streets and schools of his western Pennsylvania hometown. A civilian instructor once told him he did not have the touch to be a pilot. He barely survived his elimination flight, struggling to master the basic PT-17 biplane that washed out so many candidates. But Gabreski persisted, and by the time he reached the 56th Fighter Group in England, he had transformed himself into a natural combat pilot. He scored 28 confirmed aerial victories, all in the P-47, making him the highest-scoring American ace in the European theatre. He flew with the 61st Fighter Squadron, scoring his first kill on August 24, 1943, over Dreux, France, when he destroyed a Focke-Wulf 190. He became an ace on November 26, 1943, and achieved his best single day, on May 22, 1944, when he destroyed 3 Focke-Wulf 190s in a single mission. His capture story is one of the war's most poignant examples of how fortune could turn in an instant. Having reached the 300-hour combat limit, Gabreski was awaiting transport home. His fiancée, Kay Cochran, had been told to proceed with wedding plans, and Oil City had raised $2,000 for a wedding present. Everything was arranged. He had survived longer than most, achieved more than all but a handful, and earned his ticket home. But he requested to fly just one more mission, a bomber escort on July 20, 1944, to Rüsselsheim, Germany. On the return flight, he spotted German aircraft parked on an airfield near Koblenz. The temptation was irresistible. One more strafing pass, one more notch. On his second pass, he dropped the nose to adjust his aim, and his propeller blades clipped the ground, bending the tips. The aircraft lost power instantly. He belly landed in a wheat field and evaded capture for 5 days, living on raw vegetables stolen from farms, before being caught by German soldiers. The legendary German interrogator Hans Scharf greeted him with the words, "Hello, Gabby, we have been waiting for you for a long time." It was a standard technique, convincing prisoners that the Germans already knew everything, so there was no point in withholding information. Scharf later stated he never extracted useful intelligence from Gabreski. Imprisoned at Stalag Luft 1 near Bath until liberation in April 1945, Gabreski later became one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 wars, scoring 6.5 victories in Korea flying F-86 Sabres. He retired as a colonel and died on January 31, 2002. Robert Samuel Johnson, born February 21, 1920, in Lawton, Oklahoma, was the son of a machinist who worked on agricultural equipment. Unlike Gabreski's urban upbringing, Johnson grew up in open country, developing an understanding of machinery and a love for speed that would serve him well in the cockpit of the fastest fighter of its time. He scored 27 confirmed aerial victories in 91 combat missions, all in the P-47. On May 8, 1944, he became the first United States Army Air Forces pilot in the European theater to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record of 26 victories. Richard Bong had surpassed Rickenbacker in the Pacific about a month earlier. Johnson's most famous mission on June 26, 1943, became the defining story of the P-47's survivability. Near Forges-les-Eaux, France, 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from the 2nd Group of Fighter Wing, 26, bounced his formation. The attack was sudden and devastating. Johnson's P-47 was hit repeatedly in the initial burst. 21 20mm cannon shells and over 200 7.92mm machine gun rounds tore into his aircraft. The damage was catastrophic by any normal standard. The hydraulic system ruptured, leaving him without brakes or flaps. The canopy shattered, exposing him to the 160-mile-per-hour slipstream. Shrapnel lodged in his leg. A bullet grazed the tip of his nose. The cockpit caught fire. The aircraft spiraled toward the ground before Johnson regained control through pure instinct and desperate skill. He could not bail out because the damaged canopy was jammed shut. He could not dive to extinguish the fire because the aircraft might not pull out. He could only limp toward England and pray the fuel tanks did not explode. Then a German Focke-Wulf 190 appeared on his wing, making attack passes that Johnson could not evade. After exhausting all his ammunition, the German pilot pulled alongside, examined the shattered P-47 in apparent disbelief, and rocked his wings before turning back toward France. The identity of that German pilot remains unknown despite decades of speculation. Claims that it was Major Egon Meyer have been thoroughly debunked by historians examining German combat records, which show Meyer filed no claims that day and was stationed too far from the engagement area with a different unit. The mystery pilot's salute to a doomed enemy who refused to die has become one of the most famous images of aerial chivalry in the war, even though we will likely never know his name. Johnson landed at Royal Air Force Manston with over 200 holes in his aircraft. Maintenance crews counted the damage and shook their heads in disbelief. The aircraft was immediately scrapped as beyond repair. Johnson went on to complete his tour, became the first European theatre ace to surpass Rickenbacker's record, and returned home to write one of the classic memoirs of fighter combat. He died on December 27, 1998. Hubert Zemke, born March 14, 1914, in Missoula, Montana, to German immigrant parents, commanded the 56th Fighter Group from September 1942 to August 1944. He scored 17 3/4 confirmed aerial victories in 154 combat missions. General Doolittle called him his greatest fighter group commander, high praise from a man who had many outstanding commanders to choose from. Zemke transformed the P-47 from a maligned heavy fighter into a devastating weapon through tactical innovation and leadership. His signature contribution was the Zemke fan, a formation where fighters fanned out 180 degrees from a landmark ahead of the bomber stream, pursuing enemy aircraft independently rather than flying close escort. This aggressive doctrine was eventually adopted across the 8th Air Force and changed the nature of the air war over Europe. The Wolfpack nickname arose in late 1943 after a mission where the 56th scored nearly all enemy kills of the day, including killing Major Wilhelm Galland, brother of the famous General Adolf Galland, and a Knight's Cross holder with 55 victories. Under Zemke's command, the 56th became the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force, with aerial victories totaling between 665 and 677, depending on counting methodology. The unit produced 39 aces and became one of the most famous fighting formations in American military history. The 56th Fighter Group was the only 8th Air Force unit that retained the P-47 through the entire war, declining conversion to the P-51 Mustang. Other groups transitioned to the longer-ranged Mustang as the escort mission pushed deeper into Germany, but Zemke's Wolfpack believed they had mastered the Thunderbolt and saw no reason to change. Their results spoke for themselves. On October 30, 1944, during what was to be his last mission before a staff assignment, severe turbulence tore the wing off Zemke's P-51 Mustang. He had transferred to the 479th Fighter Group in August to take over command after its previous commander was shot down, and the irony was bitter. The man who had built the P-47's reputation was brought down not by enemy action but by weather while flying a different aircraft entirely. He bailed out, was captured, and sent to Stalag Luft 1. As senior Allied officer for thousands of prisoners of war, Zemke negotiated the German Guard's quiet departure at war's end, managed tense relations with arriving Soviet forces, and arranged the prisoners' evacuation to Allied territory. His leadership in the prison camp was credited with saving many lives during the chaotic final days of the war. Colonel Neel Kearby, born June 5, 1911, in Wichita Falls, Texas, was the highest-scoring P-47 pilot in the Pacific, with 22 aerial victories. His combat theatre was different from Europe, with vast distances over water and jungle, and an enemy who fought with fanatical courage but often lacked the equipment and training to match American technology. On October 11, 1943, Kearby led just 4 P-47s on a fighter sweep over the Japanese base at Wewak, New Guinea. Encountering approximately 48 enemy aircraft at 12-1 odds, Kearby attacked. Most commanders would have turned back. Kearby dove in. He personally shot down 6 Japanese fighters in a single engagement, setting a United States Army Air Force's single-mission record that would stand for the rest of the war. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented him the Medal of Honor in Brisbane, Australia, in January 1944. Kearby's tactical doctrine mirrored the P-47's strengths perfectly. Achieve altitude advantage using the turbo supercharger, dive on the enemy, fire at close range, then climb back to altitude. Never give the Japanese a turning fight where their more maneuverable aircraft could bring their skilled pilots to bear. He hammered this doctrine into his pilots relentlessly. On March 5, 1944, after scoring his 22nd victory, Kearby circled for a second strafing pass at low altitude, violating his own cardinal rule. He was shot down by key 43 fighters of the 77th Sentai and killed. The Japanese pilots who brought him down, Warrant Officer Koichi Mitoma and Sergeant Hiroshi Aoyagi, had demonstrated that even the best could die when they forgot the principles that had made them great. Other P-47 aces wrote their own chapters in the Thunderbolt's legend. David Schilling scored 22.5 aerial victories with the 56th Fighter Group, including 5 in a single mission on December 23, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. He succeeded Zemke as group commander when Zemke transferred to the 479th and became one of the most decorated American pilots of the war. Fred Christensen claimed 21.5 victories with the 56th, including his famous July 7, 1944, action when he shot down 6 Junkers 52 transports in under 2 minutes, becoming an ace in a day. Walker Bud Mahurin scored 19.75 victories in Europe, becoming the first European theatre double ace with 10 kills on November 26, 1943. He would become the only United States Air Force pilot to score aerial victories in the European, Pacific and Korean theatres, a distinction that speaks to both his skill and his determination to remain in combat. When the P-47 first appeared over Europe in spring 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were dismissive. They had fought the British and gained confidence against the earlier American fighters. This new aircraft looked fat, slow and ungainly. Adolf Galland, after flying a captured Thunderbolt, reported that the cockpit was big enough to walk around in. German pilots quickly identified the P-47's weaknesses and developed tactics to exploit them. They would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, knowing the P-47 could not follow, then come around and get on its tail. The Luftwaffe also exploited early range limitations, pulling their defensive line back beyond P-47 escort range and attacking bombers in the gap where they were unprotected. For a few months, this strategy worked. German interceptors savaged American bomber formations in the no-man's land between the P-47's maximum range and the targets deep in Germany. But the shift came gradually through late 1943 and into 1944, as German pilots discovered 3 unsettling facts. First, the P-47 was nearly impossible to destroy in a single pass. It absorbed punishment that would have killed any other fighter. Heinz Bahr, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces with over 220 victories, stated that the P-47 could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Second, at altitudes above 25,000 feet, the turbo-supercharged P-47 outperformed virtually all Luftwaffe fighters. The Germans had nothing equivalent to the American turbo-supercharger technology, and their fighters gasped for air at altitudes where the Thunderbolt was just hitting its stride. Third, the dive speed was uncatchable. German pilots who tried to dive away from a Thunderbolt died. The P-47 accelerated in a dive like nothing else in the sky. A declassified Air Intelligence Weekly Summary dated March 23, 1945, recorded debriefings of 22 captured German fighter pilots. Regarding the P-47, they admired its ruggedness and superb diving speed, and noted it could take a beating head-on and keep flying. They still pointed out its weaknesses, the sluggish climb rate and tendency to bleed speed in tight turns, but the respect was unmistakable. The fear was most acute among German ground troops. The Jabos's greatest effect was not destruction alone, but the total paralysis of German movement. No vehicle dared move in daylight. Supply columns waited for darkness. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. The entire German logistics system in Normandy ground toward collapse under the constant pounding from the sky. The P-47's ability to absorb catastrophic damage and bring its pilot home became legendary, and the legends are largely true. Robert Johnson's June 1943 flight remains the most famous case, with 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun rounds, fire, ruptured hydraulics, shattered canopy, and the aircraft still flying 100 miles back to England. But it was far from unique. Don Blakesley's Thunderbolt was hit by 68 cannon shells during one sortie, yet he returned to England escorted by a wingman. Gabreski reported that one of his comrades took 5 direct 20mm cannon hits in his right wing, but landed safely. Pilots reported flying home with cylinders blown off the radial engine, in one documented case 2 cylinders missing, and even with cannon holes through propeller blades. The technical reasons for this survivability were fundamental to the aircraft's design. The air-cooled radial engine was the single most important factor. Unlike the P-51's Merlin or the P-38's Allison, liquid-cooled inline engines where a single bullet through a coolant line meant engine seizure within minutes, the R-2800 had no coolant system to destroy. Individual cylinders could be shot away, and the engine continued producing power. The massive radial also served as a shield against frontal fire. The self-sealing fuel tanks used layers of rubber that swelled on contact with fuel, automatically plugging bullet holes. The turbo supercharger ducting that ran the full length of the fuselage provided inadvertent structural reinforcement. Post-crash analysis revealed the oval section ducts created a rigid structural tunnel that kept the fuselage intact even when large sections of skin were blown away. The P-47 was conceived as a high-altitude interceptor, but it became the most devastating ground attack aircraft of the war. The transition began in late 1943, when P-47 pilots pioneered tactical ground attack methods. The logic was straightforward. As P-51 Mustangs took over the long-range escort role, P-47s were freed for ground attack, and their survivability made them far better suited for the low-altitude, high-flak ground attack environment. The 9th Air Force concentrated its P-47 groups, eventually 15 groups, on tactical ground support building toward D-Day. Armed with bombs up to 2,500 pounds, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, and their devastating 8-gun battery, P-47s became the premier armored column killers. It was said that a P-47 armed with rockets had firepower equivalent to a battery of 105mm howitzers. The statistics from D-Day on June 6, 1944, to VE Day on May 7, 1945, in the European theatre are staggering. P-47 pilots reported the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. They delivered 132,000 tons of bombs. A documentary caveat is necessary here. Post-war operational research showed that fighter bomber claims against heavily armored tanks were often inflated. 50 caliber rounds could disable tracks and optics, but had difficulty penetrating heavy armor. Bombs and rockets were more effective against armor. However, the P-47's devastation of soft-skinned targets, rail transport, and supply lines was indisputable and measurable. The German transportation network in Western Europe was systematically wrecked. During Operation Cobra from July 25 to 31, 1944, P-47s provided close air support for the breakout from Normandy. On July 29, the 405th Fighter Group caught a German column trapped between Roncey and Saint-Denis-le-Vertou. The attack continued from 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening. Ground investigations confirmed 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed in a single engagement. At the Falaise Pocket in August, P-47s and Royal Air Force Typhoons devastated retreating German forces so thoroughly that Eisenhower described the scene as something that could be described only by Dante. The roads were choked with burned vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of German soldiers who had been caught in the open when the fighters came down. During the Battle of the Bulge, weather initially grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Germans their only advantage. For days, fog and low clouds protected German armored columns from air attack. Then on December 23, 1944, the skies cleared. P-47s struck with devastating effect. The 2nd Panzer Division was halted short of the Meuse River by a lethal combination of critical fuel shortages, ground counterattacks from the United States 2nd Armored Division, and relentless air attacks that destroyed vehicles and blocked roads. German officers recorded watching helplessly as their precious armor was systematically destroyed by aircraft they could not stop. First Lieutenant William Nellis was killed on December 27, 1944, pressing an attack on a German column. He had flown dozens of missions and knew the risks better than most. Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada bears his name, a permanent memorial to a pilot who died doing what the P-47 did best. The P-47's role in achieving Allied air superiority is often overlooked because the P-51 Mustang receives the narrative credit. But in the critical months of early 1944, when the Luftwaffe was being ground down in attrition, P-47s outnumbered P-51s in the 8th Air Force and did the bulk of the fighting. The turning point came when General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944. He ordered Major General William Kepner of the 8th Fighter Command to tear down the sign at headquarters that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive," and replace it with, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." Doolittle later called this the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the war. The new doctrine was aggressive. Instead of close escort, where fighters stayed near the bombers and only engaged enemies that directly threatened them, fighters spread into formations 25 miles wide, with entire groups ranging 50 miles ahead of bombers to catch German interceptors forming up or on the ground. During Big Week, Operation Argument, from February 20th to 25th, 1944, P-47s constituted the vast majority of escort fighters. On February 21st alone, the escort force comprised 542 P-47s, 69 P-38s, and just 68 P-51s. Big Week cost the Germans approximately 100 irreplaceable, experienced pilots, the beginning of a fatal attrition spiral from which they never recovered. Early P-47 range limitations were progressively overcome with drop tanks. 108-gallon belly tanks extended range to approximately 375 miles, and 150-gallon tanks pushed it to nearly 475 miles, eventually far enough to reach Berlin and back with enough fuel for combat. The result of this campaign was that by D-Day, the Luftwaffe was so weakened that Allied air supremacy was overwhelming. The famous story of Josef Priller and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk making a lone two-aircraft strafing run over the Normandy beaches captures the desperation of the German situation, though other Luftwaffe units did mount scattered attacks that day, all ineffective against the massive invasion force. 6 days after the landings, when Eisenhower's son observed vehicles moving bumper to bumper from the beaches in violation of military doctrine and remarked that they would never get away with this without air supremacy, the Supreme Commander replied simply, "Without air supremacy, I would not be here." The P-47 Thunderbolt compiled one of the most impressive combat records of any aircraft in history. It served in every operational theater except Alaska, the European, Mediterranean, Pacific, and China, Burma, India theaters, and was flown by American, British, Brazilian, Mexican, French, and Soviet pilots. Total production reached approximately 15,683 aircraft. The P-47 flew over 546,000 combat sorties. It destroyed 3,752 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while losing 824 in air-to-air fighting, achieving a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. Total combat losses from all causes were 3,499. The sortie loss rate of 0.7% was nearly half the P-51's 1.2%. The 57th Fighter Group's service in Italy was immortalized in the documentary film Thunderbolt, released in 1947 and directed by William Wyler and John Sturges. William Wyler, already famous for directing Mrs. Miniver and other classics, suffered severe and lasting hearing damage from filming in unpressurized aircraft, with only partial recovery in one ear. The Brazilian Air Force 1st Fighter Squadron flew 48 P-47D models in combat over northern Italy from November 1944 to May 1945, completing 445 missions. The Mexican 200 1st Fighter Squadron flew P-47D models with the 5th Air Force in the Philippines, completing nearly 800 combat sorties. The P-47 Thunderbolt story is one of transformation, an aircraft designed as a high-altitude interceptor that became the war's greatest ground attack platform, a dinosaur mocked by its own pilots that earned their deepest loyalty. The central irony is that the P-47's supposed weakness, its enormous size driven by Alexander Kartveli's insistence on building the fuselage around the turbo supercharger system, became its greatest strength. That size meant structural mass, redundancy, and the ability to absorb punishment that no other fighter could survive. 3 facts define the P-47's legacy. First, its 0.7% sortie loss rate was the lowest of any major American fighter, achieved in the most dangerous role, low-altitude ground attack through dense flak. Second, the 56th Fighter Group's exceptional air-to-air record proves the aircraft could compete with any fighter in the sky when flown to its strengths. Third, the destruction of tens of thousands of enemy vehicles and rail targets between D-Day and VE Day represents a logistical catastrophe for the German war machine that no single weapon system inflicted more effectively. Robert Johnson, asked years later to assess the aircraft that nearly killed him and then saved his life, on June 26, 1943, offered the most complete verdict. It had speed, roll, dive, and the necessary ruggedness that allowed it to do such a great job. As far as aerial kills go, we met and beat the best the Luftwaffe had when we first got there. It was the P-47 groups that pushed them back. The P-51s had the advantage of longer range. Then he added the line that belongs in every documentary about the Thunderbolt. Also, none of the German fighters were as rugged as a P-47. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who performed in a Paris circus before designing the most produced American fighter in history, died on July 20, 1974, in Huntington, Long Island. His dinosaur with good proportions had helped win a world war, and the lessons he learned would continue in the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-105 Thunderchief, and the A-10 Thunderbolt II that still flies combat missions today. The jug they laughed at became the aircraft they could not live without. If you have made it this far, please consider subscribing to this channel for more stories of the aircraft, pilots, and battles that shaped history. Click the notification bell to be informed when we release new documentaries, and leave a comment telling us which aircraft you would like us to cover next. Until then, keep looking up.